Hello there, friend. Welcome back to our quiet corner of history. Before we begin this evening's journey, if you found yourself enjoying these peaceful explorations through time, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything, and I'd love to know where you're settling in from tonight. Leave a comment and tell me your location and what time it is for you wherever you are in this beautiful world. It's always such a wonderful feeling to know who's joining us from across the globe. Now, dim your lights if you haven't already. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan nearby for that soft, consistent hum, a kind of white noise that seems to calm everything down. Maybe settle deeper into your blankets or pillows, get yourself comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's story together. We're about to travel backward through time, to a world that seems almost impossibly harsh by our standards today, yet was home to millions of ordinary people who faced their challenges with remarkable creativity and stubborn determination. Tonight, we're exploring the lives of medieval peasants during winter, those everyday heroes who, despite overwhelming odds, managed to survive some of the coldest, most unforgiving nights in human history. Their story isn't one of grand kings or glorious battles. It's a story of ingenuity, community, and the fierce will to endure when the world turns hostile and cold. When most people imagine medieval times, they picture gallant knights on horseback, jousting tournaments, and grand feasts overflowing with roasted meats and wine. Perhaps there were castles with soaring towers and lords presiding over their domains. But for the average peasant, and remember, these were the vast majority of people living during this era, winter was far less romantic and far more desperate. Winter wasn't a season to be enjoyed or celebrated. Winter was a test, a grueling, relentless examination of human endurance that returned every single year without fail, like a cruel teacher who never believed in second chances or mercy. Let's paint a picture for you. Imagine yourself a medieval peasant, living through the darkest, coldest months of the year. Your home is a tiny structure made of mud and sticks, what historians call wattle and daub construction. The walls are so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside if such a thing were possible. There's no insulation as we understand it today. No windows, unless you count a small hole in the wall, hastily stuffed with animal skin to block the worst of the drafts. There's certainly no thermostat, no heated radiator, no warm air gently flowing through vents. The temperature inside your home was usually just a polite few degrees warmer than whatever the weather outside was doing. If it was freezing out there in the darkness, it was slightly less freezing in here. Congratulations on that small mercy. The nights were always the worst part. Darkness swallowed everything completely. The wind outside howled like an angry ghost determined to tear your shelter apart. Inside, the fire in the hearth, your only source of warmth, sputtered pathetically, doing its absolute best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever had the good fortune to sit closest to it. If you were on the other side of the room, further back in the shadows, well, you might as well have been camping outside in the middle of winter, and at least in a real camp you wouldn't be sharing space with animals and a dozen other people. Your clothing offered surprisingly little help against the biting cold. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats, or those luxurious goose-down blankets we take for granted today. What they had was a couple of rough, itchy wool tunics that smelled perpetually of smoke and sweat. Maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat and damp wool. They would layer these garments hopefully, wrapping themselves in multiple pieces of clothing, and fantasizing that somehow all these layers would transform them into some kind of human onion, insulated on all sides. The reality was less magical. Forget about snuggling under soft quilts or down comforters. The beds, if you could even call them that, were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay, straw, or dried rushes, maybe with a few old blankets thrown on top if your family was lucky. Some beds had wooden frames if you belonged to a somewhat wealthier peasant family. Others were just piles of straw dumped directly onto the dirt floor. Luxury, as it was defined in medieval peasant life, consisted of having that straw and perhaps not sharing your bed with more than 3 other people. The cold wasn't merely uncomfortable or even unpleasant. It was genuinely dangerous. Frostbite, with its blackening fingers and toes, was a constant threat. Hypothermia crept in silently, making people confused and drowsy before they slipped away forever. Death by freezing was a real possibility that every family faced each winter. Every morning that you woke up still breathing, still capable of movement, still feeling your fingers and toes. Those mornings were considered minor miracles. They were worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast if you had any turnips left to eat. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about finding comfort or enjoying leisure time. It was about gritting your teeth through endless nights, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling close to your livestock for warmth, and praying desperately that you wouldn't wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows like some tragic frozen statue. The real adventure, the actual struggle, was just beginning when the sun set each day. If you think your modern apartment is a bit drafty because the window doesn't close perfectly, or perhaps there's a small gap under the door, medieval peasants would like to have a word with you about the true meaning of drafty homes. Their dwellings weren't just drafty in the way we use that word today. They were essentially very enthusiastic wind tunnels that happened to have a roof and some walls, constructed with the hope that they might sometimes provide shelter. Most peasant houses were built using wattle and daub construction. This meant wooden frames crisscrossed like a giant basket, then carefully smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and, yes, you read that correctly, animal dung. The dung wasn't there to be gross or offensive. It served a practical purpose. Dung was cheap, it was sticky, and it actually worked as an insulator. Plus, it was always readily available if you lived alongside animals, which most peasants did. These walls, no matter how lovingly and carefully they were smeared with their mud and dung mixture, didn't stand much chance against a proper medieval winter storm. The cold wind found every single crack, every tiny gap, every weak point. It would gleefully dance its way into the single-room homes, swirling around and making absolutely certain that residents never got comfortable, never had a moment of true warmth. Privacy? Absolutely not. Genuine warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely, in abundance. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs, made from dried reeds and straw, looked genuinely picturesque in paintings and descriptions. They had a certain rustic charm. But after a few months of relentless rain and heavy snow, they sagged under the weight. They leaked constantly. They occasionally let in the local wildlife. Rats, mice, birds, and other creatures seeking shelter from the cold. Nothing says pleasant evening quite like a squirrel deciding your dinner looks interesting and dropping into your stew. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny. Usually they were just covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters that did little to keep the cold at bay. Glass was so astronomically expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants? They were just grateful if the wind didn't completely rip the cowhide right off the wall during the worst blizzards. To make matters considerably worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, moisture seeped up through the ground from below. So technically you could say they had indoor water features, though nobody appreciated it. In winter, every single step inside your own home could feel like trudging through a frozen marsh. Cold radiating from above, through a leaky roof, cold radiating from the walls made of mud and sticks, cold rising up from below through the frozen earth. It was a complete three-dimensional assault on your body heat from every possible direction. But medieval peasants weren't the type to simply surrender to these terrible conditions and hope things would improve. They were resourceful and stubborn. They packed gaps in the walls with moss. They jammed old rags into the worst drafts. They huddled close to each other, using human insulation at its finest. Their primary weapons were creativity, stubbornness, and perhaps a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls to seal them. These were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles, frozen solid and utterly helpless. Because when your house was literally falling apart around you, and your best protection against the elements involved mud, goat hair, dung, and whatever else you could scavenge, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard to form words. As if the freezing air seeping in through every crack wasn't enough of a challenge, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy that rose from below. The frozen ground itself was their constant adversary. The floors inside their homes weren't really floors in any sense we'd recognize today. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside the structure. Maybe if you were fortunate, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the psychological comfort of thinking you had something cushioning between you and the hard earth. But make no mistake about this reality. You were sleeping just one thin, insulted layer back away from the cold, hard dirt beneath. And that cold was absolutely relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw, past your clothing, into your bones, and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, you might as well accept that it was now permanently part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants understood this threat and tried to fight this grim battle in whatever ways they could imagine. One popular method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor if your family could afford to gather enough. More realistically, if you could manage to steal enough straw from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might end up with a decent insulating barrier between yourself and the frozen earth. But straw flattened remarkably fast under the weight of bodies night after night. It got moldy even faster, especially in damp conditions. And it added an extra crunchy, rustling soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Every toss and turn created a symphony of noise. Some homes used dried rushes instead of straw. Every so often, instead of replacing the old rushes, families would simply throw fresh rushes on top of the old ones. Over time, this created a truly fascinating ecosystem. Decomposing plants, fleas by the millions, and whatever other mystery creatures decided to move in and make their home. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, somewhat damp, and smelled like a wet dog that hadn't bathed in months, the beds themselves, for those families lucky enough to have them, didn't solve the problem of the frozen earth below. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it correctly, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy, supportive mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did very little to protect against the cold, radiating up from below. Tossing and turning throughout the night wasn't about seeking comfort or finding the perfect sleeping position. It was a desperate, awkward dance designed to keep blood flowing to your extremities and avoid freezing one entire side of your body solid. The truth that medieval peasants eventually learned was simple. They didn't to conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't measured by dreams or softness or comfort. It was measured solely by whether you woke up with all your toes still attached to your feet. And if you could manage that feat, hey, congratulations, you were doing better than most of your neighbors. If medieval homes had a single hero during the brutal winters, it wasn't the roof with its leaking thatch, or the walls made of mud and dung, or even the brave layers of insulation that peasants desperately tried to maintain. The true hero, the singular savior of medieval peasant families, was the hearth. This crackling, stubborn fire pit served as the only real defense against the creeping cold, the overwhelming darkness, and the general gloom that seemed to settle over medieval life like a heavy blanket during those endless winter months. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. There was no fireplace with a fancy stone mantel like wealthy nobles had. No neat chimney sweeping the smoke gracefully skyward. Instead, what peasants had was a basic pit, or a pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you seriously wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. Yes, that's right. Most medieval homes didn't even have chimneys at all. The smoke just kind of did its best to escape. It drifted out through small holes in the roof if there were any, through cracks in the walls wherever it could find an opening, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that particular evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or for your overall life expectancy, but on the bright side, it did an excellent job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted pests. Who needs modern pest control when you're essentially marinating yourself in smoke 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? The hearth wasn't just about warmth, though that was certainly its primary purpose. It was the kitchen where meals were prepared. It was the light source when darkness fell, casting flickering shadows across the single room. It was sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People would sit around the fire telling stories, gossiping about their neighbors, or just staring into the flames, because frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea or a convenient comfort. It was mandatory for survival. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign inviting the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in the middle of winter wasn't as easy as striking a modern match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before in your entire life. Everyone in the family had a duty to contribute. Stoking the flames, watching the embers carefully, adding peat or sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood that you'd been hoarding. It was a constant, exhausting battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff out that precious flame and claim the family as its own. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire in many ways. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope itself. It was the difference between life and death, between waking up in the morning and freezing solid in the night. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more intensely than running out of ale, or losing their meager stores of grain, it was the terrifying possibility of letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector pursuing you after the harvest. And in the dead of winter, when temperatures plummeted below freezing for weeks on end, restarting a fire from absolute scratch wasn't just inconvenient or frustrating. It could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet in the medieval world. Lighters were the stuff of fantasy and dreams. Rekindling a fire meant painstakingly striking flint and steel together, hoping desperately for a single precious spark to appear, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days or weeks ago. Imagine trying to do all of this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers that barely responded to commands, while a hungry wolf howled in the distance for extra motivation and psychological torture. Now you understand why keeping that fire alive was such a serious matter. So medieval peasants got smart. They developed a technique called banking the fire. This wasn't banking money in some financial sense. Banking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely alive, until morning came. If you did it right, with the proper technique passed down from your parents, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little bit, add some fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier when you discovered nothing but dead ashes. Fire banking was genuinely an art form, passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe or secret technique. Everyone had their own little secrets and preferences about the best way to do it. Some people insisted you should use only dry ash. Others were absolutely convinced that a bit of dampness was actually the key to success. Some families packed the embers tight, creating a dense insulating layer. Others let them breathe a little bit, believing that air circulation was important. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method to your neighbors. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, or the best way to cook a steak, just with significantly higher survival stakes attached. Sometimes, despite all your careful efforts and technique, banking the fire simply wasn't enough to guarantee its survival. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy sheep might stumble directly into the hearth while moving around the cramped space. Yes, these things actually happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the middle of the night to check on the coals, making sure they were still glowing. Basically, the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to your thermostat, except far more crucial and with actual consequences. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth for your family. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember glowing in that ash pile, that was your victory right there. That was enough to face another day of battling the relentless cold that never seemed to give up or go away. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties or celebrations. It was a winter survival tactic that peasants understood viscerally in their bones. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack in the walls, there was one absolutely surefire source of warmth that never failed: each other. Human bodies pressed together generated heat that no fire could quite match. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, with neighbors, with livestock, and possibly with a very confused goose that had wandered in, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept that made sense during medieval winters. On the coldest nights, when temperatures outside dropped to dangerous levels, the goal wasn't comfort or personal preference. The goal was simple: don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households would pile into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and form what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids would squeeze in between their parents. Grandparents would snuggle under the outer layers, acting as insulation. And if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly at the door, well, there was always room for one more body in the pile. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle of this human mass, where body heat radiated from all sides, creating a warm cocoon. If you were unlucky, you ended up on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to try to get more comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud right into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain for the rest of the winter. Sometimes even bedding was a shared resource in medieval peasant homes. A communal straw mattress would slowly flatten under the nightly weight of multiple generations pressing down on it. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back in those times, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, when it's your family's survival versus the crushing cold, you stop being picky about comfort or cleanliness. You take what works, and you're grateful for it. Body heat wasn't just a nice bonus in these situations. It was strategic. It was calculated. Some medieval guides and teachings, passed down through oral tradition and the few written texts that existed, even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the sleeping group, like human shields against the cold. They would position them strategically, creating a protective barrier. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center of the group, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about individual survival, though that mattered. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of the rhythm of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under shared wool blankets. People would whisper stories to keep spirits up, pass along knowledge, share dreams of warmer days to come. So, the next time your sibling steals your blanket, or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle, a grumpy grandmother, and a particularly judgmental goat that seems to have opinions about everything. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Picture this scenario. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. All of them sharing your living space. Bringing animals indoors during winter wasn't just a quirky village tradition or something done for entertainment. It was absolutely vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, precious warmth, that could mean the difference between life and death. In a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your own stomach, every single degree of temperature mattered. Every bit of heat was precious and worth fighting for. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you and was inside your home, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. Two problems solved with one decision. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace, a strange ecosystem of humans and animals all trying to survive together. Chickens nested in corners, roosting on whatever high places they could find. Pigs snorted and grunted near the hearth, seemingly content with their spot. Cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud like they paid rent and had every right to be there. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that experience magnified 100 times. But it's a cow, it's a pig, it's multiple animals, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go for any of you. The smell's legendary. They were absolutely unforgettable. By springtime, when the animals were finally let out of the house, the perfume of a shared winter was something truly fierce and intense. You didn't need to light a candle to freshen the air. Your nostrils were already on a wild, bewildering ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose about these things. They didn't complain much because they understood one uncomfortable truth that cut right to the heart of survival. The more animals inside, sharing body heat and warmth, the fewer frozen toes in the morning, the fewer deaths, the higher the chance that your family would see spring again. It was a simple calculation, really. Comfort versus survival. Cleanliness versus warmth. And survival always won. Certain animals even had prime spots in the home, hierarchies of positioning that made sense. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family, their massive bodies radiating heat like living furnaces. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth too, and partly because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway, no matter how hard you tried to keep them out. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, up high where they wouldn't accidentally get stepped on in the darkness. And pigs, well, pigs didn't care about any social hierarchy. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor, grunting contentedly. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without its hazards and complications. Imagine drifting off peacefully into sleep, lulled by the warmth and the sounds of animals settling down, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or your face a suitable landing spot, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious and unpleasant first thing in the morning when you stumbled toward the hearth. Yes, medieval mornings could be absolutely full of surprises and regrettable discoveries. Still, despite the noise and the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs during the night, peasants understood the simple mathematics of survival. Cold kills. Cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion and style weren't about looking good or impressing anyone. They were literally about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends or fashion plates. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple and absolute. If you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once, creating a lumpy, awkward silhouette. First came the basic under-tunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt that scratched against your skin. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another one, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees. A rough cloak draped over your shoulders. And if you were really, really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations. You are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. You look like a lumpy sack of potatoes, but you're still alive. And that's what matters. Boots were a luxury that most peasants couldn't afford. Instead, many would wrap their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuff them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through that protection, well, you just added another rag and hoped desperately that you didn't lose a toe to frostbite. And forget about washing all these layers regularly. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice and then waiting 2 or 3 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt-shaped ice sculpture. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature that modern people might find disgusting, but was actually quite clever. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just considerably smellier and far less socially acceptable by modern standards. In fact, some medieval folks genuinely believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, greasy filth barrier intact, or so the thinking went. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures, more valuable than gold in many ways during winter months. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night with frostbite or waking up with all your ears still attached. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scavenge from anywhere. Sometimes they looked more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable or functional. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house in their layers. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex, the true status symbol. So, the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant survival playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off when you got a chance. It was practically a survival tool, used strategically and intentionally. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign that you'd given up on life. It was tactical, it was strategic. Dare we say it was even genius in its own way. See, winter posed a very specific problem that peasants had to solve through trial and error over countless generations. The problem was heating loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt and grime came in, and this is where medieval wisdom showed real understanding of physics, even without formal education. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just considerably smellier and more disgusting to modern sensibilities. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet with a mud wrestler, but guess what? You were warm. You were surviving. You weren't shivering yourself to sleep each night. Adding to this survival strategy, Peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's unchanged garments. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time you slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers or fresh linen. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, where every person smelled similarly bad, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. After a few weeks of winter, your own smell didn't bother you anymore, and other people's smells became just part of the background. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, well, my friend, you were winning at life. You were doing what it took to survive. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts and down pillows, think again. The reality was considerably more rustic. And by rustic we mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam that molds to your body. No orthopedic support designed by sleep scientists. No 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw, and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk that somehow worked its way through the sack. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern minimalist influencers would probably try to rebrand as earth-connected slumber or grounding sleep therapy. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary and degrading. Over time, the straw flattened from being slept on night after night, grew moldy from moisture and dampness, attracted bugs and fleas by the thousands, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone that probably smelled worse than anything you can imagine. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent and had extra straw available, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission, because it had become home to so many creatures. Rushes were a popular alternative to straw. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor of livestock aroma that seemed to permeate everything. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in through the doors or fell from above. And let's not forget the bedfellows, the uninvited guests that came with any straw or rush bedding. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did, which is to say they absolutely loved it and would move in immediately. If you woke up scratching more than you actually slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience in all its itchy glory. Despite all these hardships and challenges, these humble beds were absolute lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth below, and clumping together on top of them, multiple bodies pressed close, created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't clean, but it worked. It kept people alive through nights that would otherwise have been fatal. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress with memory foam and luxury sheets, just remember somewhere out there a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth, and saying with genuine longing, Must be nice. When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a minor nuisance or an inconvenience. They're personal attacks, deliberate assaults on your comfort and survival. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside of their homes. They fought it from inside their own dwellings, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks and gaps. And trust us, there were a lot of cracks. There were always more cracks than you could possibly seal. Walls warped under the stress of weather and time. Mud crumbled and fell away. Thatch sagged under the accumulation of rain and snow. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every single night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge against your family, determined to find every weak point and exploit it. Sealing up the house became an art form, a skill passed down through generations. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere in the walls or roof. Some particularly determined souls would daub extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Picture this scene, standing there in freezing weather, your fingers numb, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering through chattering teeth. This is fine. This is luxury. This is how survival works. Because in a way, it was. Every layer of mud and dung added was another barrier between your family and the killing cold outside. Roof leaks were another constant battlefield in the war against winter. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof or reliable, especially after a few seasons of relentless rain and heavy snow bearing down on it. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through the project but kept working anyway, because the alternative was freezing. Doors and windows, if you were lucky enough to have them, were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't hygienic, but it worked. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold that seemed to possess intelligence and determination all its own. One minute you were warm, sitting close to the fire, feeling almost comfortable. The next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, the one gap you didn't seal properly, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept even a slightly frozen state as a permanent condition, medieval peasants patched and stuffed and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them. One muddy handful at a time, one desperate repair at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, when the thought of sleep seems impossible in the face of such bitter temperatures, medieval peasants had a solution that modern people might find unusual. They didn't try to sleep through the entire night as one long block. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that would make any military commander proud. They slept in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls and official schedules. It was far simpler and much more desperate than that. Half the household would stay awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts that appeared, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying desperately to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention, constant vigilance. Left alone for too long, it would die down to almost nothing, and restarting it was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance on command. So, someone had to be on Ember Patrol every single night, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally somewhat warmish and comfortable, families rotated shifts through the night. You would doze for a few hours, get elbowed awake by whoever was next in the rotation, and then stumble over to the hearth to poke and prod and curse the fire back to life, while trying desperately not to step on a goat or trip over a sleeping pig. The rotation wasn't glamorous or comfortable. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons to press. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored the loudest during your turn to sleep. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event that seemed to take forever. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving about, animals rustling in the darkness, wind battering the walls relentlessly, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard. Getting quality rest was essentially a miracle. Yet, despite the exhaustion that seemed to accumulate day after day, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, the fire didn't go out, and by extension so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 o'clock in the morning, wondering if toes were really that important anyway. After all, you know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks and fires and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple and straightforward. Deep open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs, and in a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say a prayer, that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul with no doctors in sight, and Grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth and nose by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks, and positioned next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form for medieval peasants. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. It was like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with considerably more frostbite and significantly fewer inspirational quotes about finding your inner peace. In the grand survival playbook of medieval winters, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon that seemed almost too simple to be true: a full stomach. It turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak or more layers of clothing. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. It was a discovery born of necessity and repeated through countless winters. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the metabolic work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics, the kind of knowledge that came from observation and experience rather than from textbooks or scientific study. Eat a heavy meal before bed, generate internal heat through digestion, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread that could keep you feeling full for hours. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous animal slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes, no beautiful plating. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth throughout the night. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat, creating a prolonged heating effect. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard represented peak medieval winter luxury. No peasant would have described it that way, but it was true nonetheless. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips or found the texture of gruel unpleasant. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night, thinking about how much you missed them. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. The stakes were too high for complaints or picky eating habits. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards that shouldn't be ignored. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach, trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages and root vegetables. You might experience indigestion or discomfort. You might have strange visions or unsettling nightmares. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal or a comfortable digestive experience. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads became common luxuries, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. Sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius, born from practical necessity. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier in the day, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, any warm food would be tossed into the haybox and covered up. It would stay hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire from scratch. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better. Rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and carefully place it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress, or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to do battle against the frozen earth below. Of course, there were risks. Serious risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small localized house fire to add to your winter problems. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. Medieval burn wounds could be as dangerous as frostbite, especially with no modern medicine or antibiotics available. But when everything went right, when you managed the process correctly, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours into the night. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous or impressive, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. It was the difference between a night of constant shivering and a night where you could actually rest, at least for a few hours. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cook dinner or where you heat your water. It was practically a family member, a temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements weren't based on personal preference or comfort. They were based on strategic positioning, on survival mathematics. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate near the flames. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers, creating a gradient of warmth from hottest near the fire to coldest at the edges. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness or sentiment, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, wisdom accumulated over decades, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox with no hope of staying warm. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards, jostling for a precious sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side. The other side? Frozen so solid you could probably knock on it like it was made of ice. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched precariously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth and comfort. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise whispered to your sleeping mind. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so, peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle of warmth. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable by modern standards, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else's efforts and willingness to help. The peasants knew instinctively that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, if the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone noticed, and they went to check. Not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. It meant that your interests and your neighbor's interests were fundamentally connected. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep and genuine concern for their neighbors' well-being. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled carefully in rags. Or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space. Yes, it meant even less room and even more discomfort. But it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, when stocks ran dangerously low, villages sometimes pulled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables together. It was grim charity. No one had much. Everyone was struggling. But a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not making it through February. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. The architecture of survival in medieval villages followed patterns that had been refined over generations, though few people would have called it architecture or recognized it as such. It was simply how life worked, how communities functioned during the most dangerous months. The layout of a medieval village itself reflected an understanding of cooperative living that modern urban planners might study with fascination. Homes were built relatively close together, not for convenience alone, but for strategic warmth sharing. Smoke from one hearth could drift to warm neighboring structures slightly. Body heat from crowds gathered in a central meeting place could make a significant difference on the coldest nights. Nothing was accidental about this arrangement. It was born from centuries of hard-won knowledge about what worked and what didn't. The communal spaces, the church, the meeting hall if a village was large enough, became shelters for the most vulnerable during especially harsh nights. While these buildings were rarely heated significantly, their stone walls retained some warmth, and the sheer presence of multiple bodies in a confined space generated enough heat to make a difference between freezing and surviving. Priests understood this. They kept church doors open during the worst weather, offering sanctuary not just spiritual but physical. Tradition held that sharing was not optional but mandatory. A family that had extra stores of food was expected to contribute to communal meals during crisis times. It wasn't charity, it was insurance. Everyone understood that the roles would be reversed if fortunes shifted, if one family's harvest had been better while another's failed. The reciprocity was implicit, understood without needing to be stated explicitly. Young men, particularly those without families or those whose families had died, often became the village's winter workers. They would traverse between homes, checking on the elderly, helping repair roofs before heavy snows fell, cutting and delivering firewood. In exchange, they received meals and shelter. It was a practical system that ensured the most vulnerable were cared for, while ensuring that necessary work got done. Elderly people, far from being burdens, held crucial roles. Their experience was invaluable. An old woman might remember a particularly harsh winter from decades past, and know which herbs helped with respiratory problems, which foods lasted longest in storage, how to predict coming storms. Grandmothers were often the keepers of these crucial survival techniques, passing them down through constant repetition and patient teaching. Children, despite being vulnerable themselves, had important responsibilities. They collected wood scraps for fuel. They helped with simple tasks around the hearth under adult supervision. They fetched water from holes cut through frozen streams. They ran messages between homes. They learned early that survival required everyone to contribute what they could. There was no concept of childhood innocence that prevented them from understanding the harsh realities of their world. Marriage patterns, too, reflected understanding of survival. Marriages were often arranged not just for political or economic advantage, but to ensure genetic diversity and reduce disease transmission. Communities that had interbred too much over generations tended to suffer higher mortality rates during disease outbreaks. Though no one articulated this understanding in genetic terms, the pattern was recognized and unconsciously avoided. The role of the blacksmith became even more crucial during winter. A broken tool in summer was an inconvenience. A broken tool in winter could be a catastrophe. Blacksmiths worked harder during the months before winter, repairing and reinforcing tools, creating specialized implements for ice cutting and snow removal. They were valued members of the community, sometimes given extra provisions in exchange for their critical work. Merchants and traders, too, understood their role in the winter survival system. A trader who brought salt, dried fish, or rare spices to a village before winter set in was providing more than luxury items. These foods, with their preservative qualities, could be the difference between adequate nutrition and serious deficiency. Winter shortages of certain nutrients led to vitamin deficiencies that weakened resistance to disease. Smart traders timed their visits to ensure communities had access to these critical items before supply lines became impossible to travel. The church's role extended beyond spiritual comfort. The church building itself, with its thick stone walls and sometimes heated interior, served as a community resource. Important documents were stored there, protected by its fireproof nature. During the worst storms, people could shelter in its nave if they couldn't reach home. The priest, too, was often one of the few people in a village with formal education, sometimes serving as a mediator in disputes or providing medical knowledge, however limited. Stories and songs served practical purposes beyond entertainment. They transmitted knowledge, yes, but they also served psychological functions. A well-told story could distract people from hunger and cold for an evening. Songs could coordinate group work, rowing a boat, hauling wood, working communally. They bonded groups together, creating a shared cultural identity that reinforced community bonds when physical hardship threatened to tear them apart. Even humor played a role. Dark, bawdy jokes about winter survival, teasing comments about who was the worst snorer, gentle mockery of unsuccessful hunting attempts. All of these created psychological resilience. They allowed people to acknowledge terrible circumstances while maintaining dignity and perspective. Laughter, even at difficult situations, was a form of resistance against despair. Looking back at these medieval villages from our modern perspective, we might see only poverty and hardship. But what the people themselves might have seen was something else. They saw a functioning system. They saw people they could count on. They saw traditions and knowledge that kept them alive. They saw community in all its messy, imperfect glory. These were not isolated individuals struggling alone against the cold. They were people embedded in complex social networks, each person having a role, each person mattering to the whole. The strongest survived. But so did many of the weak, sustained by community networks and shared resources. The old, the young, the sick. Many made it through winters they shouldn't have been able to survive, not because they were particularly tough, but because their community kept them alive. This was the true genius of medieval peasant villages. Not their individual resilience, though that was real, but their collective wisdom, the understanding, developed over generations, that survival was communal or it wasn't survival at all. That sharing wasn't weakness but strength. That interdependence wasn't shameful but essential. As we drift toward sleep, wrapped in the comfort of individual beds and heating systems, we might ask ourselves what we've lost in gaining comfort and independence. Not the physical hardship, certainly. No one would wish for frostbite or hunger, but perhaps something of that deep community connection, that understanding that we need each other, that our survival is bound up with everyone else's survival. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire higher. They prayed. They prayed a lot, because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls, and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back in those times. It was woven into every frozen breath, every moment of struggle, every desperate plea for survival. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures in stained glass windows. They were winter's frontline defense, practical allies in the battle against death and cold. Saint Sebastian, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul and sliding toward pneumonia. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. St. Anthony was invoked against disease. St. Lucia against blindness that could come from snow glare or winter's crushing darkness. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts that seemed to find their way through every crack. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Some carved protective symbols into wooden door frames, small talismans against winter's malice. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls, a small flame representing hope, persistence, prayer itself. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. I swear I'll tithe more. I swear I'll confess my sins. I swear I'll light more candles. The bargains struck in the darkness were sincere and heartfelt, born from genuine desperation and hope. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort that existed only in the spiritual realm. It was a daily, urgent conversation, a constant dialogue with the divine. The peasants weren't asking for luxury or comfort or an easy life. They were asking for the basics, a little heat, a little food. One more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried people through the endless, merciless nights of winter. Faith was a practical tool, as essential as fire and as necessary as clothing. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling and undeniable. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, when survival failed despite all efforts, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel. The infamous Great Famine winter of 1315 was one such catastrophe. Rains destroyed crops across the continent. Livestock starved in the fields. Freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. These weren't myths or exaggerations. They were documented realities of survival pushed to its absolute limits. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience or a minor setback. It was often a death sentence, a direct path to freezing in the night. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring when the snow melted, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. The sight was devastating, tragic, a testament to how close death always was. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee of survival either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point with their own families and resources. Disease loved the cold. Starvation weakened the body, compromised the immune system, made people vulnerable, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. The sick would be isolated in corners if possible, but isolation was rare. More often you recovered next to everyone else, spreading illness through the tight quarters. And then there was the quiet horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs. A grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." They lived the rest of their lives with permanent reminders of those brutal nights. Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death itself, it's the eerie normality of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It wasn't unusual. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. It was part of the cycle, as inevitable as the changing of seasons. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life with fierce determination. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. There was still hope. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships. The cracked hands from constant exposure and work, the frozen toes that never quite thawed properly, the smoke-choked huts that damaged their lungs, the hunger that gnawed at them even in good years. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful and important. A legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating or thermal jackets or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind for us, was the blueprint for resilience. Every haybed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pool resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone, that survival is collective, that community isn't luxury, it's necessity. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights. All of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold, refusing to let winter break them. So, the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Their story is our story. Their struggle is the foundation upon which our comfort rests. And their determination is a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest circumstances, human beings can endure. Human beings can create. Human beings can love and help each other and survive together. The medieval peasants didn't write their story in grand histories or noble chronicles. They wrote it in the stones they shaped, in the fires they kept alive, in the children they protected, in the neighbors they helped, in the prayers they whispered into the darkness. They wrote it in every small act of survival, every creative solution, every moment they chose to fight rather than surrender. And that story, those lessons about community, ingenuity, prayer, and human resilience, still speaks to us across centuries. It whispers from the past, reminding us that warmth, comfort, and safety are precious gifts, that community matters, that caring for each other isn't optional, it's essential, and that the human spirit is far more durable than we often realize. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, wrapped in warmth that medieval peasants could scarcely have imagined, remember them. Remember their struggle. Remember their resilience. Remember that you're alive because of their determination to survive. And maybe, just maybe, let that knowledge bring you a deeper gratitude for the simple comfort of warmth, the gift of community, and the blessing of making it through another night safely. The children of medieval peasants grew up understanding something that modern children often take time to learn. Survival requires effort. Comfort is precious. Warmth is a gift. These lessons, learned in the depths of winter, shaped entire personalities and worldviews. A child who had shivered through a medieval night, who had felt the cold creeping in despite all efforts, developed a respect for fire that never fully disappeared. These children, when they grew to adulthood, approached their own winters with a kind of quiet determination. They knew what it took. They had experienced it firsthand. They understood viscerally, not intellectually, what happened if the fire went out. This knowledge wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was written into their bodies, into their reflexive responses to cold and darkness. The passing of knowledge from parents to children followed specific patterns. A father didn't just tell his son how to bank a fire. He showed him, night after night, letting the boy participate in the ritual. A mother didn't just describe how to layer clothing for maximum warmth. She dressed her daughter for winter and taught her to notice which placements worked best, which materials held heat longest, which gaps let the coldest seep through. This apprenticeship in survival began young and continued throughout childhood. By the time a medieval peasant reached adulthood, they had internalized techniques that they might struggle to explain verbally. Their hands knew how to pack moss into gaps. Their eyes could assess a roof's weaknesses before the snow fell. Their bodies understood the rhythm of the fire shift, knew how to stoke flames without wasting fuel. This knowledge, this hard-won wisdom, was worth more than gold. It was the difference between communities that made it through catastrophic winters with minimal loss, and communities that were devastated. A village with experienced firekeepers, with people who truly understood resource management, had significantly better survival rates than villages where this knowledge was less developed. Yet knowledge alone wasn't enough. There was also courage required. The courage to look at an approaching winter and think, "We can do this." Not certainty. Medieval peasants weren't delusional about their odds, but a kind of stubborn determination that said, "This is hard, and many may not make it, but we will try everything we know, and some of us will survive." This courage wasn't the dramatic kind celebrated in songs about knights and battles. It was quiet courage. The courage to maintain a fire through endless nights when exhaustion makes everything harder. The courage to share food when you're hungry. The courage to welcome a neighbor into your already overcrowded home. The courage to stand up and face another day of work when your body aches and the cold bites. For women particularly, winter brought additional challenges and additional forms of courage. Pregnancy during winter meant additional vulnerability. Childbirth in these conditions was perilous. Yet women continued to bear children, understanding the risks, but also understanding that the community needed those children to survive, to carry forward. The midwives, almost always older women who had survived many winters themselves, drew on deep wells of experience and knowledge. The role of music and song in surviving medieval winters deserves more attention than it often receives. A group of people singing together created more than just emotional warmth. The act of coordinating voices, of breathing together, of creating harmonies, it synchronized people. It made them feel less like isolated sufferers and more like a unified group. There are accounts of medieval villages singing through particularly bad nights, not once or twice, but throughout the long darkness. The songs might be religious hymns or secular ballads. The specific content mattered less than the fact that voices were raised together, that the collective sound filled the cold spaces. This singing served multiple functions simultaneously. It kept people awake during night shifts, when exhaustion threatened to pull them into dangerous sleep. It provided psychological comfort, a sense of connection and community. It marked time. A song would end and you knew that much time had passed, and you were that much closer to morning. And there's evidence that singing actually generates body heat, that the physical act of controlling breath and producing sound warms the body from within. The concept of making do reached its apex during medieval winters. Everything was salvaged, repurposed, used multiple times before being discarded. A broken tool might be repaired. A tool that couldn't be repaired would be broken down into pieces that could be used for other purposes. Cloth was unraveled and reknitted. Leather was cut into patches to repair other leather items. This constant reuse wasn't because of environmental consciousness, though the effect was the same. It was simply practical necessity. There was no option to throw something away and buy a replacement. What you had was what you had to work with. So ingenuity was required, developed, honed, passed down. Old people, and in medieval times, anyone who reached 50 or 60 was genuinely old, held special status in communities during winter. Beyond their knowledge, they carried something else, proof of survival. An elder who had survived 10, 15, 20 winters was living evidence that it could be done. Their very presence said, "Look, we made it through those difficult years, we can make it through this one too." Yet the elderly were also vulnerable. The cold was harder on aging bodies. Arthritis made it more difficult to work. Weakening eyes made night work harder. And yet many communities found ways to continue valuing and protecting their elders. This wasn't sentiment, it was practical. Lose your elders and you lost critical knowledge, lost connection to the past, lost moral authority in the community. The relationship between peasants and their livestock deepened during winter in ways that summer inhabitants might never understand. These weren't pets or abstract economic resources. They were survival partners. The cow that generated warmth, that provided milk, that would eventually provide meat, that cow was as crucial to survival as any family member. Animals sensed the stakes too, in ways we can only speculate about. A cow that had learned winter meant sharing a human dwelling seemed to accept it with a kind of stoic patience. Chickens that had huddled for months, in small spaces, displayed different behavior than chickens that only spent a few weeks indoors. Whether animals actually understood what was happening or simply adapted behaviorally is unclear, but the practical result was the same. Livestock that had wintered indoors multiple times seemed to adjust faster to the harsh conditions than animals new to this arrangement. as the winter winds gradually began to ease, as the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon, the medieval peasants would emerge from their ordeal transformed, not physically broken beyond repair, though many bore scars, but changed nonetheless, deepened, made wise by their survival. The children who had huddled through those long nights learned lessons that money couldn't teach. The adults who had maintained fires and sealed walls had proven their own resilience to themselves. The transition from winter to spring was never abrupt. It was gradual, almost hesitant. The snow would linger in shaded places long after it disappeared from the fields. The river would slowly thaw, rushing with new water and energy. The animals, thin and weakened from the long confinement, would be led back outside. The houses, which had been sealed so carefully against the cold, could finally be opened to fresh air and sunlight. But perhaps the most significant transition was internal. The constant vigilance, the perpetual tension of survival could finally ease. People could sleep longer than an hour or two. The rotation of fire watchers could finally end. Meals could be lighter and less about generating heat and more about actual nutrition. The daily mathematics of survival could temporarily be put aside. Yet even as spring arrived and winter's grip loosened, the lessons remained. The knowledge of what it took to survive, the understanding of what humans could endure when necessity demanded it, the deep appreciation for community, for neighbors, for family. These understandings didn't fade with the warming weather. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble woman with powerful family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple. Yet from these seemingly modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root, a life that would one day tilt the course of English history. From an early age, Anne was set apart not by her wealth or birth rank, but by her mind. She was clever, spirited, and by all accounts, magnetic in personality. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands, an experience few English girls could dream of. There, Anne absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished and perfected. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, and wit. While other young women perfected their embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it deliberately. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare and remarkable, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic beauty in the conventional sense. Even her admirers admitted as much, but she was arresting in her presence. Dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace. Anne didn't just enter rooms, she changed their gravity, their energy, their very atmosphere. At a time when a woman's fate was often sealed by birth and marriage, Anne refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. The stage of English court politics would be her arena. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, clever and ambitious, untested but brilliant. History was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn entered the court of King Henry VIII, she was unlike anyone the English nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and quick, sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court. At first she played the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native speaker, and laughed with a confidence few women dared display. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaisons. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. She teased, she challenged, she refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell into obsession. Letters passed between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court. Anne, astonishingly, said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the entire court. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice. Not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis that would shake England to its foundations. Henry wasn't merely besotted, he was obsessed, and in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag, namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable, but Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, because she had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage, she was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still Henry pressed on, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart, she was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII. A bold move, given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life. But the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, but others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse on the realm. Anne entered her queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir. Anne knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were elated, certain the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history crowned with the sacred oil, usually reserved for kings. Her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Courtiers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once obedient Henry began moving England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head, all so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands. Rivals circled, waiting. And Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. But as history has taught us again and again, the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the relentless pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking relentlessly. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed each one, miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away. His disappointment carved rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the great whore, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything Anne was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She tried desperately to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground. Anne had won her crown through cunning and courage, but in the brutal shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. As we bring this long journey through history to a close, as we wind down from the stories of survival and struggle, of ambition and downfall, let us remember the deeper truths these narratives reveal. Medieval peasants and queens, revolutionaries and ancient builders, all of them faced challenges that demanded everything they had. All of them made choices that rippled through history. The peasants taught us that community, ingenuity, and stubborn determination can overcome almost any obstacle, that humans can survive in conditions we would consider impossible, that caring for one another isn't optional, it's essential to survival itself. Anne Boleyn taught us that ambition carries a price, that intelligence and courage can take us places we never imagined, but that the same qualities that elevate us can also threaten those around us, that even the most brilliant and determined among us are ultimately vulnerable to the changing tides of fortune and politics. These stories, reaching back across centuries, remind us that we are part of an unbroken chain of human experience. We inherit the resilience of medieval peasants. We carry forward the lessons of those who came before. And perhaps, if we listen carefully to these whispered voices from the past, we can learn to be better, wiser, more compassionate versions of ourselves. As the night deepens around you, as sleep begins to claim you, let these stories settle into your consciousness. Let them remind you of the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. Let them show you that survival, triumph, failure, and legacy are all part of the human story. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this great tapestry of human history. Sleep well, safe in your warmth, grateful for the struggles of those who came before. Tomorrow, the world will be waiting, but tonight you have earned your rest. Anne Boleyn's final days in the Tower of London were marked by a strange mixture of fear and peace. In her chambers she had time to reflect on the choices that had brought her to this point. She had gambled everything on her ability to charm, to manipulate, to maintain power through wit and intelligence. And for a time, it had worked. She had achieved what few women in history had achieved. She had become queen. But power, she now understood, was far more fragile than she had realized. It rested on the whims of one man. It could evaporate in moments when that man's attention shifted. She had believed, perhaps naively, that providing a son would cement her position permanently. She hadn't fully understood that Henry needed her to be expendable, that his narcissism demanded admiration without challenge, compliance without intelligence. Her daughter Elizabeth, bright and strong even as an infant, would survive this ordeal. She would grow to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Though Anne wouldn't live to see it, though she wouldn't know that her daughter would bring England to new heights of power and culture, somehow it seemed fitting that from this catastrophe, from her failure to produce the male heir, would come a female ruler of unprecedented ability and longevity. On the morning of her execution, Anne dressed with care. She chose a gray damask gown trimmed with fur, colors of dignity and sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair carefully, preparing herself for the blade with the same methodical attention she had once devoted to her appearance at court. There was a strange grace in this final act of self-preparation, a last assertion of control over her own person before losing everything. Her final words, spoken to a small gathering of witnesses, were remarkable for their grace. She did not curse Henry. She did not beg for mercy. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who was sending her to her death. In those final moments, she seemed to embody something beyond ordinary human pettiness, a kind of transcendence that comes from accepting one's fate with dignity. The sword was swift. The French executioner, brought specifically for the purpose, was a professional. It was over in a moment. The queen who had rewritten England was gone. She was buried quickly in a simple grave within the tower. No great ceremony, no elaborate tomb, just a hasty grave and quickly moving on to the next of Henry's wives. Yet somehow, in death, Anne achieved a kind of immortality that she never achieved in life. She became legendary. Centuries later, people still speak of her. Books are written about her. Her brief time as queen changed England forever. The Church of England, born partly from Henry's desire to marry her, exists still. The break with Rome, the Reformation in England, all of it traces back to this remarkable woman who refused to be merely a mistress. Her daughter Elizabeth would inherit her mother's intelligence, her boldness, her ability to command attention. And Elizabeth would rule where Anne had been cast aside. Perhaps that was Anne's true legacy, not her own brief time as queen, but the daughter she left behind, who would become a greater queen still. As we contemplate Anne's story, lying in the warmth of our beds, we might reflect on the strange ways that history unfolds. That greatness isn't always recognized in the moment. That sometimes the most profound impacts come from people who lived briefly, who failed in their immediate goals, but whose very existence changed everything that came after. The Boston Tea Party, too, changed everything. It was a moment when ordinary people made a choice that rippled across the world, when they decided that principle mattered more than fear, when they chose uncertainty and possible death over the certainty of continued subjugation. The men who dumped tea into Boston Harbor that night couldn't have known that their action would spark a revolution that would spread across the American colonies and eventually across the world. They couldn't have known that they were helping to birth a new nation. They couldn't have foreseen the long chain of consequences that would flow from that single night. They were making a choice based on what they believed in the moment, based on their understanding that there were things worth fighting for, that there were lines worth crossing, that sometimes the only way to effect change is through direct action, through violation of unjust laws. The American Revolution they helped start would be messy and brutal and uncertain. Many would die. Families would be torn apart. The outcome was never assured. But they made the choice anyway, because some things seemed worth the risk, and history is full of such moments. Moments when ordinary people make extraordinary choices, when they decide that comfort and safety aren't worth the price of their principles, when they step across a line knowing they can't step back. These moments, medieval peasants deciding to help a neighbor survive, Anne Boleyn deciding to demand marriage instead of settling for being a mistress, American colonists deciding to destroy tea instead of paying taxes. They're all part of the same human story, the story of people trying to create something better than what they inherited, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, but always trying. The ancient city of Carroll teaches us another lesson, that civilization and greatness don't always look like what we expect, that a society can achieve remarkable things, building massive structures, creating trade networks, developing complex social organization, without conquest, without war, without dominating neighbors. Carroll was peaceful. There's no evidence of weapons, no signs of battles. Yet it thrived for centuries. It was a city built on cooperation, on trade, on shared beliefs and shared work. It was a different kind of greatness than the empires that conquered and dominated. We often think of history as being made by kings and warriors and great military leaders. But Carroll reminds us that history is also made by ordinary people cooperating peacefully, by merchants trading goods, by communities working together to build something lasting. The 4 stories we've explored tonight, medieval peasants, Anne Boleyn, the American Revolution, ancient Carol, they all teach us something different. But together, they teach us that human beings are capable of remarkable things, capable of surviving impossible circumstances, capable of taking risks for their principles, capable of building complex societies, capable of sacrificing for each other. These lessons, these stories, they're not just historical curiosities, they're reflections of human nature, of human potential. They're reminders that we contain within us the same capacity for creativity, for courage, for community that our ancestors contained. As sleep comes, as your consciousness begins to fade, let these thoughts settle into your mind like gentle snow falling on winter fields. You are part of a long chain of human beings stretching back thousands of years. You carry in your body and mind the legacy of countless people who struggled, who survived, who created, who loved. The warmth you feel tonight is built on their struggles. The freedom you might take for granted is built on their sacrifices. The peace you might enjoy is built on their choices to cooperate rather than dominate. And tomorrow, in your own small ways, you carry forward their legacy, in how you treat your community members, in the choices you make, in whether you choose compassion or cruelty, cooperation or domination, truth or self-serving lies. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It's something you participate in every day. Every choice you make ripples forward, just as every choice our ancestors made ripples backward, creating the world we inherit and the world we create for those who come after. So, rest now, in peace and warmth and safety. Rest knowing you are part of something greater than yourself, a human story that stretches across millennia and will continue long after you're gone. You are a link in an unbroken chain, and that chain, forged in struggle and strengthened by community and sacrifice, is one of humanity's greatest achievements. Tomorrow you will wake. You will face your own challenges, your own choices. But tonight, sleep. Sleep well, sleep deeply, sleep peacefully. You have earned it, as all humans have earned it, through the struggles of your ancestors and the struggles you navigate in your own time. Close your eyes now. Let the stories settle. Let the warmth of history and humanity wrap around you like the warmest blanket ever woven, and drift into sleep, carrying with you the wisdom of medieval peasants, the courage of queens and revolutionaries, the patience and genius of ancient builders. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep well,